The night I stood on my front lawn watching my dream home go up in flames, I finally understood something I should have realized long before. Moving to Oak Haven Estates wasn't just about a house. It was about control, power, and the people who'd do anything to keep it. Across the street, my neighbor Victoria watched too, her arms folded, the faintest smile tugging at her lips. Beside her, her husband's construction crew stood around a water truck that, conveniently, wasn't working. Flames tore through my garage, and I wondered how it had come to this. If I'm going to tell you how standing up to HOA corruption nearly cost me everything, I need to take you back. 6 months back, to be exact. That's when Sarah and I first drove down the tree-lined streets of Oak Haven. It was everything we'd ever wanted. A classic colonial house with a wraparound porch, trimmed hedges and maples that blazed red in the fall. The realtor had mentioned there was an HOA. We nodded, barely listening. We were too caught up in the idea of living there. Everyone smiled and waved. It felt safe, welcoming. We should have known. The first hint that something wasn't right came in the form of a welcome basket. Tom Henderson brought it over, an older guy with soft eyes and a face lined from years of stress. A bottle of red wine, some cookies, and a warning. "Watch yourself around Victoria Blackwood," he said, glancing toward the corner lot where a white mansion sat like a throne. "She's been running the HOA for 15 years. People who challenge her don't tend to stay long." He smiled when he said it, but there was nothing funny about the way his eyes flicked to my house and back again. I laughed it off. How bad could a homeowners association really be? I got my answer at the very first HOA meeting. Victoria Blackwood made an entrance like royalty, heels clicking, blonde hair pinned back so tightly it looked painful. She didn't sit. She stood, so everyone had to look up at her. "We'll be increasing dues by 40%, she announced. "Necessary upgrades to critical infrastructure." I raised my hand, asked if we could see the bids from the contractors. Her smile was the kind of cold that could freeze your bones. "Mr. Mitchell, while we value your enthusiasm, the board has already approved the measures." She moved on without another word. I could have let it go. I should have let it go. But I'd spent a decade as a corporate compliance officer. I knew how to spot a scam, and this smelled like one. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of grinding metal. Out front, an excavator was tearing up my driveway. Victoria stood there, clipboard in hand. "Oh, Michael," she called out like we were old friends. "Didn't you get the notice? We're updating all the driveways to meet HOA standards." There hadn't been a notice. Not to me, not to any of my neighbors. But Victoria just smiled and pointed to a line in the bylaws giving her emergency powers. "Critical repairs," she said, "for the good of the community." That night, Tom stopped by again. "They did this to the Patels," he told me, lowering his voice. "Ripped up their new driveway. Forced them to use Blackwood Construction to replace it. Charged them triple what it was worth. They moved out 3 weeks later." He gave me a long look. Victoria doesn't like people who ask questions. I spent the next week digging. Every contract, every single one, went to Blackwood Construction, the company owned by Victoria's husband. Every time someone questioned it, they suddenly found themselves fined, cited, or sued. Some moved out, some fought back, none lasted. At the next HOA meeting, I showed up early, had my slides ready, my spreadsheets. I wasn't going to accuse, I was just going to show people the numbers. Victoria made it about 3 minutes before the power went out. "Looks like we'll need to adjourn," she said, closing her laptop with a snap. "Technical difficulties." As everyone filed out, she cornered me by the coffee table. "You've got a lovely home," she said softly. Too softly. It'd be a shame if anything happened to it. I didn't back down. I should have. That night, I sat in front of my monitors and watched as Victoria's husband and his crew dumped something on my newly repaired driveway. By morning, the concrete was cracking, failing. They wanted me to beg them to fix it. Instead, I made some calls. Within 2 days, I had a team of forensic accountants and private investigators pulling every thread they could find. It didn't take long before we had enough evidence to make your skin crawl. Fraud, extortion, money laundering. This wasn't just a crooked HOA president lining her pockets. This was a criminal operation disguised as community improvement. Victoria must have known we were getting close. That's when my garage caught fire. The fire department was delayed. No one knew why. But the flames did their work. They revealed things I might never have seen otherwise. Like the fact that my security system had caught Victoria's husband at my house the night before, or that my car's gas tank had been filled with sugar 2 days earlier, or that my mailbox had been smashed twice in the same week. I doubled down, upgraded everything. Security cameras, motion detectors, an automated gate across my driveway. Tom helped me install them. "It's cheaper than letting her win," he said. We both knew what was at stake. The gate didn't last long before Victoria sent the police. She stood on my sidewalk with a folder of regulations, claiming the gate was an unauthorized modification. Officer Jensen, who'd clearly seen this kind of thing before, was polite but tired. "It's private property," he said, "and it's not blocking the street." Then I showed him the footage. The gas tank, the fire, the late-night visits. He flipped through the files slowly. "Would you like to file a report, ma'am?" he asked Victoria. Her face turned red. "We have standards," she snapped. But Officer Jensen was already walking back to his cruiser. The next day, I found a fine taped to my door. $5,000. Behavior detrimental to community harmony. But this time, they'd made a mistake. The letterhead had Blackwood Construction's watermark faintly visible behind the HOA logo. It was a sloppy move, and it was all I needed. That night, Tom came over with a stack of old HOA records he'd been collecting quietly for years. "I've been waiting for someone like you," he told me. We pored over them together, millions in contracts, all routed through shell companies, landscaping businesses that didn't exist, consulting fees paid to Victoria's personal LLC. It was blatant, and it had gone on for 15 years. The next morning, my gate was rammed by a bulldozer. Security footage showed Victoria's husband behind the wheel. I called Officer Jensen again. This time, Victoria had papers, permits for construction, claims that the damage was an accident during approved maintenance. There wasn't much Jensen could do without evidence of intent. That's when Sarah spoke up. "You're thinking like a cop," she told me. "We need to think like reporters." She was right. We didn't need to catch Victoria breaking the law. We needed to expose her. I started calling former residents, people who'd sold their homes and left without looking back. The stories they told were chillingly familiar. Harassment, fines, vandalism. Then suddenly, steep repair bills, always from Blackwood Construction. Some had even faced foreclosure after failing to pay. It was a pattern, and it was obvious. Victoria must have known we were on to her. That afternoon, we got notice of an emergency HOA meeting. Agenda, new bylaws. One in particular caught my eye. It gave the board power to place liens on homes for unpaid fines. They could take our house if we didn't pay. Sarah was the one who said it out loud. "They're trying to force us out." We had evidence, we had witnesses, but we were running out of time. That's when I made the call. To Diana Chun, an investigative reporter with a reputation for taking down corrupt developers. She was skeptical at first. "Another HOA horror story," she said. But then I sent her the files. She called back 10 minutes later. "This isn't corruption," she said. "This is organized crime." And we just kicked the hornet's nest. The message came just after midnight. A simple text from an unknown number. "Check the HOA's offshore accounts." I stared at it, my mind spinning. Offshore accounts. Tom had warned me Victoria's operation ran deep, but I wasn't prepared for this. We were dealing with something bigger than a shady construction deal. This was money laundering on an international scale. I forwarded the message to Diana Chun. She was already working overtime, piecing together a narrative out of the documents Tom and I had dug up. At first, she'd thought this was just another HOA dictatorship, another story about lawn lengths and mailbox colors gone wild. But the more she saw, the more serious it became. "This isn't a homeowners association," she said. "It's a front." And Victoria knew we were closing in. That morning, I woke up to find my front yard torn to pieces. A water main was broken, flooding the yard and pouring into the basement. Mud covered everything. And like clockwork, a letter from Blackwood Construction's lawyers showed up, claiming I was responsible for damaging their equipment and that they'd be pursuing legal action. It was laughable, except it wasn't. They wanted to bury me in repairs and lawsuits until I caved. But they'd made a mistake. My cameras had caught everything. Victoria's husband standing by as his crew smashed the water main. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. Bright, clear footage, logos on their vests, timestamps on the video. Sarah spent the morning calling every insurance adjuster in the region, documenting the damage. Tom was at my dining room table, flipping through bank records, tracing wire transfers that always lined up perfectly with HOA emergency projects. Offshore shell companies, Caymans, Luxembourg. Got you, he whispered, printing out another set of statements. 15 years of money laundering, hiding in plain sight. Diana's story was almost ready. We just needed to hold out a little longer. That's when Victoria made her next move. An invitation slid under my door. An emergency HOA meeting. Not at the community center, where they usually held them, but at Victoria's house. Hand-picked attendees, and for some reason she'd invited me. Sarah stared at the invite like it might explode. "It's a trap," she said. I knew she was right, but I had to know what Victoria was planning. If there was a last-ditch effort coming, I needed to see it. Victoria's living room was everything I expected. Sterile, expensive, perfect. 20 neighbors perched on white leather furniture, sipping wine, eyes darting between each other. Victoria's husband stood by the door, blocking it. She was by the fireplace, holding a USB drive like it was a weapon. "Michael," she said, smiling, "I'm so glad you came." She plugged the drive into a massive TV on the wall. The footage that played wasn't mine. It showed me, blurry and grainy, in a dark office. The HOA's office. Breaking in, or at least, that's how it looked. "We found this on our security server," Victoria said. "You understand how serious this is." The footage was fake. I'd never set foot in their office after hours. But the way she said it, the way people nodded around the room, I knew she'd already sold them on the lie. "We're willing to make this go away," she continued. "All you have to do is sign over your proxy votes, retract your allegations, and we can move forward." I opened my mouth to answer, and Tom's voice boomed from the doorway. "I wouldn't sign anything if I were you." He stepped inside, followed by Diana, and behind her, 2 FBI agents. The room froze. "Victoria Blackwood," one of them said, stepping forward. "We have questions about Cayman account number 4. The second agent moved faster. Papers flew everywhere as neighbors scrambled. Victoria stood rooted to the spot, and that same perfect smile frozen in place. "You don't understand," she said, her voice cracking. "I did this for the community. The kickbacks, the contracts. It was all about keeping the neighborhood beautiful, safe, valuable." Diana was already recording. "And the offshore accounts? The fabricated evidence? The vandalism? You're destroying everything I built," Victoria screamed. Then she grabbed a crystal vase from the mantel and threw it at the nearest agent. Her husband slipped toward the back door, but we were ready for that too. Officer Jensen and his team were waiting in the alley. Victoria's husband made it 3 steps before they tackled him to the ground. A briefcase burst open beside him, papers spilling everywhere, shredded contracts, forged documents, bribe ledgers. As the agents cuffed Victoria, neighbors who had once followed her blindly pulled out their phones. They had evidence too, photos of vandalized cars, recordings of threats, copies of bills that never made sense until now. People had been quietly documenting it all, waiting for someone to take the first swing. Tom clapped a hand on my shoulder. Not bad for 6 months in the neighborhood, but it wasn't over. As they loaded Victoria into the squad car, she leaned toward me. "You think this is over?" she hissed. "You have no idea what's coming." And she was right. Her arrest was supposed to be the end. Instead, it was the match that lit the next fire. Later that night, as I sat with Diana reviewing security footage for the article she was about to publish, my phone buzzed. Emergency alerts. Fires. Multiple homes. All belonging to residents who'd spoken out against Victoria. One after another, their homes were burning. Sirens wailed in the distance, but they weren't getting there fast enough. It was the same delay I'd experienced when my garage went up in flames. "Contingency plan," Tom said grimly, racing through the front door. "Victoria's husband made bail an hour ago. They're torching evidence and sending a message." Sarah didn't waste a second. She pulled up the neighborhood emergency contact list and grabbed the phone. "We're not waiting for the fire department," she said. "We have 300 neighbors and garden hoses." I watched from my front steps as porch lights flicked on up and down the street. Doors swung open. People poured out carrying hoses, buckets, extinguishers. Families that hadn't spoken in years suddenly working together, forming lines, fighting the flames, house by house. Retired firefighters took charge, organizing the effort. Even kids ran water back and forth. Victoria had wanted to burn us down. Instead, she forged us into something stronger. But the fires were only a symptom. We needed to cut off the infection at the source. Officer Jensen called with a tip. Victoria's husband was holed up in the HOA office, shredding everything he could get his hands on. Tom and I drove there fast, catching sight of two construction trucks peeling out of the parking lot. Inside, the office was a mess. Papers everywhere, the air thick with burning plastic from the industrial shredder. "It's over," I said, blocking the exit. He didn't look scared. He looked tired. "You think Victoria was in charge?" he said. "She was just the face. We've got boards like this in 3 states. Construction contracts, kickbacks, insurance fraud. You've barely scratched the surface." He wasn't lying. Diana's investigation went national. The FBI found HOA boards across multiple neighborhoods, tied together by Victoria's real estate firm. It wasn't about lawns and fences. It was a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise. Over the next 6 months, 14 HOA boards were dissolved. 3 construction companies shut down. 28 people faced federal charges. Victoria and her husband took plea deals, trading names and information for shorter sentences. It didn't matter. They were done. But that wasn't the real story. The real story was what came after. Oak Haven Estates held emergency elections. Every HOA seat was contested. For the first time, people showed up, debated, voted. Tom was elected president. His campaign? Radical transparency. Every contract was competitively bid. Every dollar spent was posted online. HOA meetings were streamed. Anyone could watch. Anyone could ask questions. The old guard said we were overreacting. We called it accountability. Remember that text about offshore accounts? We found out it was Victoria's daughter, a teenager who'd overheard her mom on the phone too many times. She was elected to the board too, head of community outreach. She was the one who started the community garden, organized volunteer home repairs for elderly neighbors. 1 year after Victoria's arrest, we gathered for a very different HOA meeting. No fines, no threats. Just people celebrating a neighborhood they'd rebuilt together. Property values, they were higher than ever. Not because we bullied people into compliance, but because people wanted to live there. Sarah and I still have the cameras up. The heavy-duty gate, we leave it open now. It's more of a joke at this point, a reminder of what we fought through. Most of the footage we catch these days is kids riding bikes, neighbors walking dogs, Tom grilling in his backyard. Last week, a moving truck pulled up in front of Victoria's old house. A new family. They looked nervous. You could see it in their eyes. They'd heard the stories. Tom showed up first, organizing the welcome wagon. Diana's kids helped them unpack. Sarah handed them a printed copy of our new HOA charter. I walked up and shook their hands. "Things work a little differently here now," I told them. They asked about Victoria. Everyone does. I pointed at the photo in the community center, the one taken during the fires. Neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder, garden hoses spraying in the dark. Fighting not just for their homes, but for each other. Sometimes, I said, you have to fight fire with fire. But most of the time, you just have to stand together. And this time, we're not backing down.